pretty incredible Torah portion. And it's nice to see the faces of the people who are on screen. So hello.
Shalom,
especially-
Rabbi Nickerson.
Shalom.
This is Donna. I got a new iPhone. I'm learning how to do the Zoom thing, but I'm watching you all the time. I saw your family dancing and singing. It was so beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
This is Donna.
Hi, Donna. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a conversation and study this portion together. And at certain points, I'm going to be sharing my screen so that you can see the text, because I'm not sure if everyone actually has the text in front of them. So hopefully everyone kind of has a sense of how to use this. Where there's going to be some points where I'm going to ask some questions, and I would love for people to share their thoughts. And you can just unmute at that point if you want to share a thought, or you can raise your virtual hand and I can call on you. So we'll kind of do it that way as we go through it together. Okay, sound good?
Sound good.
Great. Okay. So let's begin, of course, with the blessing for engaging in the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank you, God, for giving us this opportunity to engage in the study of Torah. Amen. Okay, so we're going to begin right off the bat with a couple of questions. How would you define an argument for the sake of heaven? And how would you define an argument that is not for the sake of heaven? How would you define an argument for the sake of heaven? And how would you define an argument that is not for the sake of heaven? There's no wrong answer here. So I'm curious. Any thoughts? Someone want to take a stab at what would be an argument? How would you define an argument that is for the sake of heaven?
Boy.
I would say for the sake of heaven would be for the sake of arguing what is the best way to, let's say, feed the poor, house the hungry, and all that. Not for the sake of heaven, which could be an argument that is just personal. An argument about looks, about polls, and how someone looks to the public. So that's for an ego satisfying argument, and someone then against it.
Okay, so you're defining an argument for the sake of heaven as something that is about a larger, broader issue, as the ones that you mentioned, elements that are linked to Jewish values or ways in which we can improve the world. And those that are not for the sake of heaven would be those that are focused more on the ego, more on the individual, more on more base arguments. Is that correct? Did I get that right?
Better than I did.
Okay, great. So thank you. That's Susan's perspective. Other thoughts on how people would define?
Rabbi, I was thinking, love the Lord your God with all your heart and your neighbor as yourself. Eternally, we're all going to end up being together. And what we do on this planet to make a difference and bring love, like Cantor Peacock sings this beautiful song about love. If we live our lives with love, that's all for the sake of heaven.
Okay, great. So arguments that are in the line with this idea of love, and how do we bring more love into the world and love the Lord your God with all your might, with all your soul, similar to the Ve'ahavta. Okay, great. Other thoughts on either what would be an argument for the sake of heaven or not, or not for the sake of heaven? Any other ideas? Okay, that's fine. Oh, yeah, Merle, go ahead.
I'm just thinking, as far as not for the sake of heaven, hatred and exhibiting hatred in all ways.
In the way in which people are arguing, or if the argument is about hatred? Or both?
No, in the way in which people are arguing.
Okay.
Assuming that if it was a discussion about hatred, that it would be trying to teach somebody right from wrong.
Okay, great. So you're saying that another way in which we could differentiate an argument for the sake of heaven versus one that is not is the way in which people argue, and
right.
Whether or not they are using hate speech or
Right.
the way in which you engage in the argument determines whether or not it is for the sake of heaven or not. Okay,
Right.
great. These are all wonderful. Now, this is a question. I did not come up with this question. The rabbis of the Mishnah came up with this question. And so here we go. In Pirkei Avot is a section of the Mishnah, just a very quick overview of where we are. The Torah, the 5 books of Moses, as we know, has 613 mitzvot. Some of them are not as detailed as the rabbis would have liked. And so then we have the law code of the Mishnah, which comes to try and give some more specificity to the laws that we find in the Torah itself. Later on, we have the Talmud, which takes all the laws that we find in the Mishnah and goes into even more detail. There is a section of the Mishnah called Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Fathers, which aren't necessarily based on the laws of the Torah itself, but bring up wonderful, incredible wisdom that many of you have probably heard some of them before in the past, and this is one of them. So this is the beginning of it. This is just part 1. Which is an argument for the sake of heaven? The argument between Hillel and Shammai. Now, for those of you who remember Hillel and Shammai, they argue a lot. We have the organization which I worked for at both Stanford and University of Pennsylvania, which is Hillel, the International Organization for Jewish Students on College Campuses. It's not called Shammai, and that's because Hillel usually is the one who wins the arguments. One of the most famous arguments is the one where we talk about the lighting of the candles on Hanukkah. Do we start with 8 candles and take 1 away each night? Or do we start with 1 candle and add 1 each night? And as you know, we start with 1 candle and we add. And that was an argument between Hillel and Shammai in the Talmud, and Hillel's argument wins out. So the rabbis ask, what is an argument for the sake of heaven? It is the way in which Hillel and Shammai argue. And how do Hillel and Shammai argue? We find the answer to that in the Talmud. And in the Talmud it says, for 3 years, the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai argued. One said the halacha is according to our position, and the other said the halacha is according to our position. And a heavenly voice spoke. A heavenly voice is all over the Talmud. These and those are the words of the living God, and the halacha is according to the house of Hillel. A question was raised. Since the heavenly voice declared both these and those are the words of the living God, why was the halacha established to follow the opinion of Hillel? It is because the students of Hillel were kind and gracious. They taught their own ideas as well as the ideas of the students of Shammai. Furthermore, they even taught Shammai's opinions first. Okay? So what makes an argument? Anyone want to summarize for us what differentiates the arguments between Hillel and Shammai according to the Talmud? I know I just took it off screen, so I can put it back on screen. Someone want to just kind of summarize it and try and encapsulate it really, really quickly for us?
Shammai was a strict constructionist, and Hillel was more of a humanist and adaptable to change and time.
Good. And in the fact that Hillel also was willing to share not only their own ideas, because Hillel is not only a person, Hillel was kind of a whole house of learning that would taught their own opinions as well as the ideas of the opposing position. And they even would teach the opposing position first. Okay, so this is the framework by which we're supposed to understand the argument between Hillel and Shammai. And it goes even further. One of the rabbis from the 1300s says the argument between Hillel and Shammai, in their debates, one of them would render a decision and the other would argue against it out of a desire to discover the truth, not out of cantankerousness or a wish to prevail over his fellow. Okay, so in addition to what the Talmud had said up above about the idea of the strategy by which Hillel argued, here we also get the sense that they are doing it, their arguments, the two of these two groups were arguing for the sake of finding truth and not in an attempt to prevail over the other. Okay, so you'll see why I'm bringing all this up. This is all kind of preliminary to the Torah portion. But right now we have a sense, according to the rabbis, what makes an argument for the sake of heaven. It's one in which people are just trying to discover truth. There's a way in which they engage with one another that is both respectful, that even gives precedent to the other argument. So if I was arguing with someone, I would, if we're going back and forth in a debate, I wouldn't put the focus on my argument. I would actually focus my attention on the other person's argument and start with that. And that would be the way in which I would hope to discover and reveal how my argument is true. Okay, so there's a strategy that's being laid out here. Any questions yet? No. Okay, now let's see what the Pirkei Avot says about the opposite. What is the argument that is not for the sake of heaven that we find? Because Avot 5:17 continues, which is an argument not for the sake of heaven, the argument of Korach and his company. And this is the link to this week's Torah portion, because this week is Korach and the story of Korach. So if the Pirkei Avot is laying out of all the different types of arguments that take place in the Torah and throughout our tradition, they are comparing Hillel and Shammai to Korach. And so why is that the case? And that is what I'm hoping that we're going to look at today, because one of the most important elements of the Jewish experience is argumentation, is debate, right? We are a people that throughout our history and throughout our texts are really a historical documentation of arguments, of debates. That's what the entire Talmud is. You don't find many cultures where that is the case, where both positions, the minority position and the majority position, are included in the canon of texts that are passed down from generation to generation. You would assume that what is passed down is what is considered true and real and the right answer, and that would be the only thing. And that would be a more dogmatic approach to how we would pass down information. And yet Judaism does something completely different and passes down both perspectives, which is both sometimes very confusing and frustrating, and at the same time, I think has led to us being a people who recognize the value of both education and the value of being in conversation and debate in which we can actually find truth in a way that you can't if only one position is presented. Okay?
That is,
so, yeah, go ahead.
That is the basis of the statement that 2 Jews, 3 opinions. But the Gemara and the renditions of all of the scholars who contributed to discussing the nuances of the law, because the law has to apply in human conditions, and human conditions vary under every circumstance, so that the law has to be broad and interpretable under many different elements to that argument of the value of halacha and what it really represents in base.
Yes, that we can't, Judaism realizes that if you are going to create a system of values for an entire society, you have to take into account the complexity of that society, and you have to take into account the complexity of the human condition. And therefore, your argumentation and debate has to be as complex as possible to mirror the human experience. And therefore, if you go through that debate in a complex manner, you are going to get closer to being able to create a system that can represent a whole society. So yes, that's a great way of understanding and trying to define why it is that we take this approach in our tradition. Okay, so now let's get into the actual text itself, because I want us to see if we can understand what is it that happens with Korach and his band of brothers, so to speak, that it is so powerful that the rabbis of Pirkei Avot are willing to compare it to Hillel and Shammai. Okay, so let's look at the beginning of the text. Oh, by the way, so what is this? An argument not for the sake of heaven was that of Korach and his company, for they came to undermine Moses, our master, may he rest in peace, in his position out of envy, contentiousness, and ambition for victory. Let's see if that's the case. So Numbers 16, 1-3, this is the beginning of the Torah portion. Now Korach, son of Issachar, son of Kohath, son of Levi, so from the Levites, betook himself along with Datan and Aviram, sons of Eliav, and On, son of Pelet, descendants of Reuben, to rise up against Moses, together with 250 Israelites, chieftains of the community, chosen in the assembly, men of repute. They combined against Moses and Aaron and said to them, "You have gone too far, for all the community are holy, all of them, and the Lord is in their midst. Why then do you raise yourselves above the Lord's congregation? Okay, so the first question is this a fair question that they're asking? You've gone too far. All the community is holy, all of them. And the Lord is in all of our midst. So why do you raise yourselves up above the rest of the congregation? This is what Korach and Datan and Aviram and 250 other elders, leaders of the various tribes, remember the 12 tribes, and Reuben is from one of the tribes. Levi is another tribe. The Levites, just to remind you of the background, of the 12 tribes, the Levites have a special role alongside the priests. They were the ones that at the tabernacle, and then later on in the time of the temple in Jerusalem, they were the ones who would play the music, who were guards at the doors of the temple. They were the helpers of the priests, the Kohanim. Aaron and his sons and his descendants were the priests themselves, and then the Levites were the helpers. So the Levites, for example, don't have any territory that's given to them when all the Israelites enter into the land of Israel, which happens after the Torah, because remember, the Torah ends before we enter into the land of Israel. Once Joshua takes the Jewish people into the land of Israel, the Levites don't get a specific plot of land. They are kind of spread out. You find them in the towns, cities of refuge, which we'll talk about at some other Torah study. And they were the helpers. So we have Korach, who is a part of the Levites, and then you have Datan and Aviram, who are descendants of Reuben. Reuben was Jacob's oldest son. Okay, and so we have those three kind of at the top, and then we have all these people supporting them, and they go and they ask what may seem as a legitimate question: if everyone is holy, why you, Moses and Aaron, are you above or acting above everyone else? Aren't we all holy? Don't we all deserve the same kind of respect or responsibility? So what do people think? Do you think that is a fair question? Do you think it's an unfair question? What do you think so far about Korach and the question that he is posing to Moses and Aaron? Yeah, Susan.
Well, initially it sounds fair in the sense the Levites, when they are temple guardians, that's in the future. But at this point, they've been in charge of all the accoutrements and the porterage of it. God said it for them. And Moses and Aaron are Levites too. So they're in the same clan or tribe. So right now it seems fair. We know it's going to not be fair because it was for their own self-aggrandizement at this point. And when they stood at Mount Sinai, they were all holy then. You know, it's not the statement in the Torah that you are a holy nation, you are all holy. So at this point, it sounds like a fair, question.
Yeah, right. I would agree with you. At this point, we don't, of course, we don't know tone. If we go back to what Merle had suggested in the very beginning about the way in which people argue, right now we don't know tone. We can't hear tone. But depending on how you read that, it could be something like, well, aren't we all holy? Yeah. Don't we all isn't God with all of us? If you listen to it that way, it seems like a pretty legitimate question to be asking. Jeff and then Merle.
Oh, everyone is created equal, but some of us are more equal than others. And the difference is that who chose Moses and Aaron? God. And the ultimate problem with Korach in this parsha is that Korach denies God. And he denies the importance of God to the choices that were made, that his judgment equals God's judgment. And that is the height of blasphemy and the basis of his sin and punishment, it seems to me.
Okay, great. Merle?
I was just thinking that the question maybe should have been, or should be, why were you chosen? What makes you so holy? Or holiness, why were you chosen to do this job over anyone else in the tribe?
Good. Okay, good. And Cindy in the comments wrote, if he had asked the question, why do we need a leader? Would that be different? Like, why not have a more democratic approach to this as opposed to you being the leader? Okay, good. Any other comments on Korach's approach at this point?
Rabbi, I would think
yeah.
I'm thinking in terms of all of the things that the Lord had done for us when we came out of Egypt, and all the miracles and the manna and everything that the Israelites witnessed God's hand through Moses, listening to the Lord, that they would not. I think it's just kind of disrespectful in a way to question Moses' authority after what God had done.
Okay, great. So another argument could be made that what's wrong about Korach's question is not necessarily the validity of the question of whether or not we're all holy and equally holy, but that it's a disrespectful slight at him, given all the things that he had done up until this point to guide the Jewish people not only out of Egypt, but all the fetching that they were doing all along their journey through the desert, and then to say all of a sudden, what's going on? Like, why are you so special? Okay, great. Any other thoughts? Okay, so let's see what happens next. When Moses heard this, he fell on his face. And then he spoke to Korach and all his company, saying, Come morning, the Lord will make known who is his and who is holy, and will grant him access to himself. He will grant access to the one he has chosen. Do this, you Korach and all your band, take fire pans, and tomorrow put fire in them, and lay incense on them before the Lord. And then the man whom the Lord chooses, he shall be the Holy One. You have gone too far, sons of Levi. Okay, at this point, Moses seems to be suggesting, okay, I'm a little upset by what you're doing. You've gone a little too far, but you know what? You and your people are going to come and we're going to do these fire pans, and we're going to lay incense, and we're going to see who God chooses to be the leader, which is a pretty bold move, because there is the potential, even though probably Moses knows it's not going to happen, that God could choose Korach. So he's laying it out there. And Moses further said to Korach, Hear me, sons of Levi. Is it not enough for you that the God of Israel has set you apart from the community of Israel and given you access to him to perform the duties of the Lord's tabernacle and to minister to the community and serve them? Now that he has advanced you and all your fellow Levites with you, do you seek the priesthood too? Truly it is against the Lord that you and all your company have banded together. For who is Aaron that you shall rail against him? Okay, what is Moses' argument here? I think this is an important argument that he's making when it comes to how we're supposed to understand what's wrong and how our tradition is seeing what's wrong with Korach's approach to this otherwise seemingly, his question of aren't we all holy on its face is a fine question. So what's Moses saying here? What is it that we're starting to hint at about what's wrong with Korach's approach in terms of how he's bringing up this argument with Moses that is key, that our tradition is kind of keying in on?
Questioning God's wisdom.
Okay, yeah, questioning God's wisdom. Also, what is it that Moses says that Korach has had access to? Is basically, Korach, you've been given all of these incredible gifts already. You and your tribe of people are already a special group. So to me, this is starting to play out, and if we kind of try and take it to our own lives, when do we recognize how much we've been given already? And is there a certain point where we may be crossing a line where we're expecting too much, or we're not being grateful for what we do have, and that there's a certain line that can be crossed between being grateful for what we have and starting down a road of trying to take what may be beyond our reach, or maybe be pushing our limits, that sometimes we fail to recognize how many gifts we've been given. And we may be focused a little bit more on what we haven't been given. What I'm thinking of is the 10th commandment. If you remember the 10th commandment, does anyone remember what the 10th commandment is?
Covet your neighbor's
Do not covet.
Field and house and cattle and everything that is not yours.
Exactly. The 10th commandment, which I think is actually the most important commandment, because if you follow that commandment, everything else falls into place, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you are so focused on what other people have and wanting what other people have. Now, one of the greatest things that I think, and my wife and I have talked about this, about being in quarantine, is all the things that are flashy that people for the most part have have done to present themselves to the outer world no longer applied in quarantine. It didn't matter what kind of car you drove or what clothes you wore, because no one saw your car or your clothes because they're at home the whole time, right? There are
That's for
certain
sure.
things that our society has put on the top of the pedestal as things that we have defined as successful, ways in which we define success, that in this new landscape that we've lived in have no longer applied, right? I was driving the other day and I pulled up next to a Lamborghini, probably a $250,000 car, beautiful car. And I thought, up until now, buddy, you haven't been able to be driving that car around and no one has seen it, right? So there is something here about Korach, what he's doing and what he's focusing on is not the gifts that he's been given already and all the benefits that he's come into in his life, but he's focusing on what's missing. And we sometimes can get caught up in that, right? And I think as we're moving out into the world, I talk about this all the time in my Talmud Tales class, but another thing to be thinking about is, are we going to fall into that trap of starting to compare ourselves to other people, my home to theirs, their clothes to mine, the cars, whatever it is that are overt signs of differentiation, and especially at this time where our society is really keen in on the fact that there have been some systemic challenges in our society that have been those who have and those who have not, right? If we think about all the racial injustice that have been percolating in the last few weeks, that is really playing into that. Are we going to fall into the same trap, or can we make sure that this is a time where we can start to approach this in a different way? So I think what we're hearing from Moses is he's saying to Korach, stop focusing on what you don't have. This is one of your big mistakes in your question, is that under that question is the fact that you are trying to suggest that it's not fair, even though you have been given so much. Yeah, go ahead.
Your original choice of questions was the holy from the profane. And this is when Korach's argument descends from the holy question to purely the selfish and profane, and typifies why he's going to be punished the way he's punished as things go along in the story.
Yes, but Jeff, what's interesting is that this is just Moses responding to Korach's question. Korach doesn't articulate out loud what Moses is bringing up. Moses is reminding him. And so I think what it's teaching us is that let's be aware of the kinds of questions we're asking and what's underneath what we're asking, because sometimes you can either assume that Korach is asking a very legitimate question, but really what we're finding is that underneath some of the questions and the arguments that we make are not really for the sake of heaven, because they're really about our own gain or what we're looking for ourselves. It wasn't about the holiness of the community. It wasn't about equality. It was what Moses is getting to, because we also assume that Moses understood who Korach was and had a relationship and knows these people who are kind of coming up against him. There's the ability that sometimes someone needs to call you out, and that we have a responsibility, if we are on the other side, when someone starts to ask a question that may seem a little fishy, or may seem to be that there's an underlying issue that they're not really saying, do we have a responsibility to speak up? And you can either do it in an accusatory way, which Moses does, or in a more questioning way, a more curious way of saying, well, what about this? Or what? So we're also, I think, seeing, as we will see with Korach's punishment, Moses is also flawed in this piece. It's not that he does everything right, as we know in future, like next week's Torah portion, he makes a big faux pas, and that's why he never gets to go into the land of Israel. So it's not that Moses is a perfect character, which is why he's such a brilliant character in the Torah, because he's not perfect. But here we're getting a sense that there are underlying elements to what Korach is trying to suggest here. Any other thoughts on this one?
Just think, here's the ultimate leader of the entire people, not summoning Korach to him, but he humbling himself and going there as God's representative to clarify, to attempt to heal, and then show God's strength by what he says and ultimately what happens. And it's It's an unusual move for the leader to go to the offending party and try to create peace.
Yes,
That may be
yes.
said as part of his greatness or not. I'm not sure. But the idea is that this becomes a visual lesson for all of Israel, that you
Great.
don't deny God's choices.
Good. Okay, let's keep going. Moses sent for Datan and Aviram, sons of Eliav, but they said, "We will not come. Is it not enough that you brought us from a land flowing with milk and honey to have us die in the wilderness, that you would also lord it over us? Even if you had brought us to a land flowing with milk and honey and given us possession of fields and vineyards, should you gouge out those men's eyes? We will not come." Moses was much aggrieved, and he said to the Lord, "Pay no regard to their oblation. I have not taken the ass of any one of them, nor have I wronged any of them." Okay, now we have an example of a couple of things. Datan and Aviram refused to come and have a conversation and sit down at the table with Moses, right? Huge problem in our tradition. And this is, again, why I think Pirkei Avot is laying out why Korach and his band are examples of an argument not for the sake of heaven. You can't have an argument for the sake of heaven if you aren't willing to have the conversation, right?
Mhm.
And it's easy sometimes to just say, "No, I disagree. There is no way I'm talking to you about what you're suggesting here. Forget it. It's not even worth my time." And here, the text seems to be indicating that that's a real problem, that leads to destructive behavior when you're unwilling to even engage in the conversation, especially if you are going to create a false narrative about the past. Because Datan and Aviram, if you read closely, said, "You took us from a land of milk and honey for us to die in the wilderness." Excuse me, Egypt was not a land of milk and honey at all. That was a land of slavery, of bitterness, of pain. For you to then all of a sudden come up with an alternative fact about what happened in Egypt, that is not okay, right? And so here we have the two-pronged challenge that I think still applies to this day. Number one, the ways in which some people will try and redefine history, even though they were a part of it, in order, who knows, there are multiplicity of reasons why they may do that. And also the unwillingness to sit down at the table and actually have a conversation, no matter where you're coming from, right? And it seems to be that their pain or their anger is so much, or they are feeling so disrespected that they aren't even willing to sit down. And if you're not willing to do that, that's a real problem. Miriam.
A very simple thing. I don't want to argue with Jeff, but he did say that Moses.
It's okay to argue if it's for a
Moses Jeff, you did say that Moses picked up and went. I think the text says that Moses asked Datan and Aviram to come to his table. They refused, but he did not pick up and go to them.
Does that change things for you, Miriam?
It does a bit. It
Okay,
does.
also.
Because he said there are so few leaders that pick up and go to the other party or the other country or the other physical place in order to bring peace. There's so few leaders that did that. Anwar Sadat did that. He came to Israel, and Golda said, "What took you so long to come here?" But in this case, Moses, unless I'm not reading the text correctly, Moses did not pick up. And I mean, he had many fantastic other qualities.
Yeah,
he was so humble, and he was always pleading for his people to God to be very lenient on his people. And he had them in mind before he ever had himself in mind. But in this case, it seems that he said that he summoned Datan and Aviram.
Good. Yes. As we see here, Moses heard and fell on his face, and then he spoke to Korach, right?
Yeah.
So there isn't that he's not going to him there. And here he sent for Datan and Aviram, but they said they will not come, right? So yes.
Yes. Hi, Miriam. Rabbi, I'd like to, along with Miriam, in history, people that deny the Holocaust, they deny that they don't recognize Israel's right to exist. They don't want to come to the table and have a conversation. And hopefully through love, and we will have a change in this world through the people that want peace and love and music, and bring about a change where we can bring people to the table for Israel's sake and for the world's sake.
Yes,
I
amen to
hope
that.
so. I surely hope
Yes.
so.
All right, let's keep going. Thank you. Okay, we can skip that. Punishment. Let's see what happens and how we feel about this punishment. The question I want you to be thinking about: does the punishment fit the crime, and why this type of punishment for what Korach does? Okay, Moses said to Korach, "Tomorrow you and all your company appear before the Lord, you and they and Aaron. Each of you take his fire pan and lay incense on it, and each of you bring his fire pan before the Lord, 250 fire pans. You and Aaron also bring your fire pans." Each of them took his fire pan and put fire in it, laid incense on it, and took his place at the entrance of the tent of meeting, as did Moses and Aaron. Korach gathered the whole community against them at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Already a military kind of image of a war taking place. Then the presence of the Lord appeared to the whole community, and the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "Stand back from this community, that I may annihilate them in an instant." But they fell on their faces and said, "O God, source of the breath of all flesh, when one man sins, will you be wrathful with the whole community?" The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the community and say, withdraw from about the abodes of Korach, Datan, and Aviram." In other words, don't destroy everything. God's saying now, okay, just leave Korach and Datan and Aviram. Everyone else get back. Moses rose and went to Datan and Aviram, the elders of Israel following him. He addressed the community, saying, "Move away from the tents of these wicked men and touch nothing that belongs to them, lest you be wiped out for all their sins." So they withdrew from about the abodes of Korach, Datan, and Aviram. Now Datan and Aviram had come out, and they stood at the entrance of their tents with their wives and their children and their little ones. And Moses said, "By this you shall know that it was the Lord who sent me to do all these things, that they are not of my own devising. If these men die, as all men do, if their lot be the common fate of all mankind, it was not the Lord who sent me. But if the Lord brings about something unheard of, so that the ground opens its mouth and swallows them up with all that belongs to them, and they go down alive into Sheol, you shall know that these men have spurned the Lord." Scarcely had he finished speaking all these words when the ground under them burst asunder, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up with their households, all Korach's people and all their possessions. They went down alive into Sheol with all that belonged to them. The earth closed over them, and they vanished from the midst of the congregation. All Israel around them fled at their shrieks, for they said, "The earth might swallow us up."
Wow.
Crazy. Straight out of a movie, right? You can just imagine the CGI of of this happening, right? A great dramatic scene. What's interesting, what it wasn't until recently that I kind of discovered this. The more and more I found Moses's human side, in other words, his fallibility, not only his successes, but it's almost as if he has created this punishment for them, right? He says, well, look, if they're going to live like and die like everyone else when their time has come, then I wasn't sent by God. But if, let's say, oh, I don't know, if the ground swallows them up, then we know that I am the God. And then, of course, all of a sudden, then the ground swallows them up. So there is something, and this goes back to my earlier point about how Moses, as a leader, has his moments where he kind of sometimes falls into the trap of those who he's trying to lead, right? In this case, Korach, who's using attack strategies to come after Moses. And here Moses uses an attack strategy back to punish Korach, because yes, God is the one who ultimately punishes them, but it's really Moses who sets that up. And we can imagine as if giving the idea, so to speak, to God of all the crazy things, because there's no other place in the Torah where someone is swallowed up in the ground, especially humans swallowed whole into the ground. It's almost as though Moses's imagination, his frustration, his anger has led to this type of punishment. So I'm curious what you all think about this punishment. Does it fit the crime? Yes or no? And other thoughts. Miriam.
This Parsha always disturbed me ever since I'm a young person. And now that I'm a very, very old person,
No, not a
it
chance.
disturbs me, an old grateful person.
Oh, you're
It
beautiful.
disturbs me, equally disturbs me. Why? Because I'm not looking for a solution to my disturbance. It's okay. I'm even disturbed by Cain and Abel. I'm not sure that Cain planned to kill Abel. It could have been a spur of the moment thing. I'm disturbed by a lot of things I read in the Bible, and I hope to always be disturbed. That's okay. I don't need it tied up in a little bow. But one of the most important sentences of this entire parsha has stuck with me so much that I even know it in Hebrew. And Ha'ish echad yachata al kol ha'edah. If one man sins, will you be angry on the entire assembly? Now, there's no answer to that. The sentence does not get answered. The question does not get answered at that moment, nor does it ever, except that God swallows up the entire, I think, 250 Adah people in the congregation. It went down in the earth with Korach, even though they were not sinful like he. So let this always disturb me. Let this sentence always stay with me, because I find it very operative. And we can relate it to anything in today's world, because those thugs and those angry, anti-law few people did a horrible thing by burning the stores when the people were marching peacefully. They burnt the stores of poor entrepreneurs that had spent their lives building up these stores. And the people ran in and they looted. Several of them, we don't know the numbers, but enough thugs, I can't think of another word, did this. Therefore, the protesters should never be blamed for the fact that they refused to stand silent. They were peaceful protesters. They should never be lumped into the destruction of this. Enough.
Okay, thank you, Miriam. And I think what you're raising, it's a theological question. It's really about your theology. Are we all to be? Is one person's problem enough for everyone to be punished, or to fall into the same category? There's, yes, you raise a really interesting point, and you're right. The question is not answered here, and those, but I also, there is guilt by association, which is another factor that's in here. Those 250 people who rose up with Korach, even though they are anonymous according to the story, we don't know their names except for Datan, Aviram, and Korach. All these other leaders also are also responsible for the fact that they stood behind this person who was going about things in the wrong way, who is looking to be a leader of divisiveness, not a leader of collaboration and of peace, right? And if we also want to talk about the world today, if there are leaders who are looking to divide, if there are people who are rising up in order to take on not an argument for the sake of heaven, there are a lot of people who are behind those people, those leaders, who also have to take responsibility for standing behind those people. And that's why November is going to be a really interesting thing, because that is a test, as it is with every 4 years and every 2 years, and when we do it, locally. It's going to be a real test for what does it mean to stand behind the values that matter to you in this country. And I'm not going to get into the details of that. You know what I'm saying. But this is a really important thing that we have to remember, that even in today, what this portion is saying is that the ramifications of the leader are not just left with the leader. If you align yourself with a certain personality and a certain leader, you have to deal with what comes with that, good or bad. And that, in a democratic setting like ours, gives us actually a lot of power to make a decision who we want to stand behind, what kind of values we want to stand behind. And that's why it's so important that we have a voice. So even though these characters in this story were voiceless, the literal standing, and I think I was thinking about this based on what you were talking about protesters, that we have to figure out a way to both
political.
put people together, and that you can't separate every individual, that we are going to lump people together. And at the same time, we do need to recognize that there is a separation between the leader and everyone else. And yet, is there really? I don't know. So I don't know where I'm going with that, but I do think that there are a lot of things that a lot of cautionary elements of the story that we need to be thinking about for ourselves and our society in this next year. Okay.
Getting back, Rabbi, to the picture of this punishment.
Yeah.
Think about the magnitude and the absolute uniqueness of this punishment. Normally, the soul has to go through its tribulations and purifications to get to Sheol. 250 people are sent to Sheol alive. And what is most important is they're not given the ability to practice teshuvah or to turn back. It is such an absolute and utter destruction of the soul that it stands out in its actual degree of inhumanity to how people are punished. And the fact that it takes teshuvah away from people. No one is saved. No one is repenting. No one has the opportunity to do that. That is a very challenging issue that in and of itself has to be commented on.
Yeah, it's a great point. And actually, oh yeah, go ahead, Susan.
They were given the opportunity for teshuvah. Moses came to both Korah and Dathan and Abiram, and it was their families. So we're talking about a close unit. It wasn't all of the Israelites, the rest of them fled, but it was their supporters that fell into this hole. And some have speculated it might have been an earthquake. Oh, and we've seen what earthquakes have done, but you know, they're not concerned with earthquakes here. And if it was an earthquake, then did God make that earthquake? But they were given the opportunity for teshuvah. And in terms of Sodom and Gomorrah, they created that kind of society. And think of German society too, that yeah, there were a lot of them supporting Hitler. So it wasn't just Hitler and Goering and the groups. There's a community that supports this kind of leader.
Yeah, I see we're almost out of time.
Rabbi, I just want to say,
yeah,
a famous NASCAR race driver's son, they found a noose in his garage. This is just this hatred, and Disney is now making the princess a black princess. We have to come to the reality that we should love everyone, no matter who they are, what religion, what color their skin, rich or poor, like the first commandment. And that's all I wanted to say.
The noose was a pull. They found everyone jumped to conclusions, but they said
correct.
The rope was to pull the garage down, and they didn't know whose garage it would be. I mean, it ended.
Yeah. It's a weird play, you know, because that NASCAR just came out yesterday saying it's the only one that had a noose in it, and yet they can't determine if it was done on purpose, and the FBI couldn't determine it. It's a weird situation. What's interesting is that the people after this are extremely upset at Moses, and talk about the injustice of the fact that all of these people were kind of swallowed up into the earth. And Moses actually has to come up with a new strategy to try and prove the leadership of him and Aaron. And so the next version is really this idea that they should all bring a staff, and whoever's staff blossoms will be the leader and the one chosen by God. And it turns out that Aaron's staff blossoms into almond blossoms, and he is the chosen one. But it's a very different approach, right? So even Moses had fallen into the trap here. And I think that the Torah again is teaching that sometimes when there is someone who is who is going after an argument that is not for the sake of heaven. And here I would say the way in which I am thinking about an argument for the sake of heaven and one that is not. An argument for the sake of heaven is the one for the search of truth. An argument not for the sake of heaven is one in the search of power or victory, right? Or of strength. Those are the two different ways in which you can have an argument. When you argue for the sake of truth, when you lose, you also win because you are in the search of truth, and that's ultimately what you're looking for. That an argument between two perspectives where you are almost collaborating in a sense, even if you disagree, to find truth. That's different than arguing in order to try and gain victory or to win or to find power, because in those kind of arguments, then everyone loses. And in this case, Moses and Korach, I think, are both fail the test. And Moses learns the lesson, and he didn't fall into the pit. So he gets to try again, and he uses a much more peaceful approach, which is the almond tree, this almond staff, the blossoming. It's a very different kind of approach. And we have to be very careful not to fall into the trap of arguments for the sake of power and victory, because those forces, I think, are more powerful. And I think we see those types of arguments happening in our country, where people are willing to go to battle, where it's a battle for victory, for winning, to put down the other, as opposed to a more collaborative, let's figure out what is true and let's go for that. And when I'm wrong, it's not the end of the world, and I can be okay with not winning the argument, because we're all searching something that's bigger. We're searching for a larger truth. And so that I think is one of the main reasons why Korach has such an intense punishment, because the Torah wants to remind us that when you are in a position of power, or when you are engaging in a conversation with someone who is in a position of power, you need to be very careful that you don't fall into the trap of having an argument that is purely for the sake of trying to gain your own power or to maintain your own power. That is a destructive way in which we engage with one another. That we have to work towards Hillel and Shammai and the way in which they engage, which is try and find a way in which you can have a conversation where you can engage in something that is not about winning. And our society more and more has been set up about winning and losing. That is the type of language that is being used all over the place. And that is not a healthy way for us to be understanding what it means to be a successful, thriving society. It's not about winners and losers. And there are people who are literally saying that person is a loser, right? Using that kind of language itself is falling into the trap of an argument for the sake of victory or power. And that leads to destruction. And we need at this time more than anything to be bringing people together, to be looking for that peace and that love, the camaraderie, the collaboration that we need in this city and in this state and in this country and in this world, so that we don't get swallowed up, so that we don't cause not God to open up the earth, but that we cause that for ourselves. And we have that unfortunate power to be able to do that. And so I think this is a really important lesson that we're learning in this week's Torah portion, to make sure we do everything we can not to fall literally into that trap.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
We're out of time. It was really wonderful. Thank you for everyone who shared your thoughts, and it's nice to see you all. And I hope you have a wonderful Shabbat, and a peaceful one and a restful one. And look forward to seeing you all again soon. And we have Shabbat services tonight at 6 p.m., tomorrow morning at 10 a.m., and then a whole bunch of learning sessions all next week and throughout the summer. So
Thank you,
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Shabbat shalom.